Minnesota winters in 1868 did not forgive mistakes. Lars Nyberg saw this firsthand when frost crept inside cabin walls that were built exactly by the book. Most settlers spent weeks peeling every inch of bark from their timber, believing the army manuals that said smooth wood prevented rot. When Lars refused to strip his logs, neighbors called him lazy and predicted his home would decay within 3 years. They were wrong. While their clean logs cracked and rotted at the foundation, Lars applied a specific harvest technique rooted in Scandinavian tradition. His cabin remained 12 degrees Fahrenheit warmer and lasted twice as long as the standard structures nearby. This video will analyze the exact steps and logic behind this counterintuitive method. What did this builder understand about tree biology and insulation that the experts missed? The rush for land in the upper Midwest following the Civil War brought thousands of families into the deep forests of Minnesota and Wisconsin. By 1865, the Homestead Act had turned the hardwood and pine forests into a patchwork of claims, where survival depended entirely on the speed and quality of shelter construction. For the vast majority of these new arrivals, the instructions for building a log cabin were clear, rigid, and standardized. Military manuals, settler guides, and word of mouth from established homesteaders all agreed on one non-negotiable rule: the bark must be peeled from the logs immediately after felling. This prevailing wisdom was rooted in a basic understanding of tree biology that seemed logical on the surface. Between the rough outer bark and the hard inner heartwood lies the cambium layer and the sapwood, which are rich in sugars and moisture. The common belief held that if the bark remained on the tree, this sap layer would ferment, attracting insects and trapping moisture that would inevitably rot the timber from the outside in. To prevent this, responsible builders spent days or even weeks laboring with draw knives and hatchets, stripping every square inch of bark to expose the clean white wood beneath. It was backbreaking work that added significant time to the construction process, but it was viewed as the only way to ensure a cabin would stand for more than a few seasons. John Cartwright, a third-generation settler who prided himself on doing things by the book, exemplified this approach. On his homestead, piles of white pine logs sat gleaming in the sun, stripped naked, and ready for stacking. To Cartwright and his neighbors, a peeled log was the sign of an industrious, intelligent builder. It signaled that the homesteader understood the dangers of the frontier and was willing to put in the hard labor required to mitigate them. When they looked at a pile of smooth, pale timber, they saw permanence. However, the reality of the environment began to dismantle this theory within the first 24 months. The problem with stripping the bark was not just about labor, it was about how the wood reacted to the atmosphere once its protective layer was removed. Without the bark to regulate the drying process, the outer layers of the logs lost moisture rapidly, while the interior remained damp. This uneven drying caused significant surface tension, resulting in deep, longitudinal cracks known as checks. These checks opened the heart of the log to the elements. When the heavy spring rains arrived, water did not shed off the round surface of the log. Instead, it was channeled into these deep fissures, pooling inside the wood where the sun and wind could not dry it out. By the second winter, settlers who had meticulously peeled their logs began to notice the consequences. The bottom courses of logs, closest to the splashback from the eaves and the damp soil, turned dark and spongy. Inside the cabins, the air grew heavy and dank. The cracks in the logs allowed cold air to bypass the chinking, and during the summer, the moisture trapped deep within the checks created a breeding ground for fungal decay. The very method designed to prevent rot was, in fact, accelerating it by exposing the wood's pores to the erratic cycles of soaking rain and baking sun. Into this landscape of deteriorating confidence stepped Lars Nyberg. Arriving from Sweden in the late 1860s, Nyberg brought with him a set of construction values that completely contradicted the American frontier standard. He ignored the advice of the local land agents and the warnings of neighbors like Cartwright. When Nyberg felled his timber, he did not reach for a draw knife. Instead, he dragged the rough, dark logs directly to his building site, the bark thick and intact, covered in moss and lichen. To the community, this looked like negligence. In a culture that equated hard work with moral virtue, skipping the peeling process was interpreted as a lack of character. Neighbors derided Nyberg's unpeeled cabin, joking that he was simply too lazy to finish the job. They pointed to the rough texture of his walls, predicting that the bark would harbor beetles, and that the moisture trapped against the wood would cause the cabin to collapse before his second harvest. Nyberg was branded as unskilled, a greenhorn who would learn his lesson the hard way once the rot set in. Nyberg, however, was operating on knowledge passed down through generations of builders who survived in climates far harsher than Minnesota. He understood that the bark was not a trap for moisture, but a shield. In his native Scandinavia, builders treated the bark as a natural shingle. It was designed by nature to shed water and protect the living tree. Nyberg reasoned it would do the same for the dead log if handled correctly. He saw the checking in his neighbors' cabins not as an unavoidable accident, but as a direct result of stripping the tree's skin. As the months progressed, the difference in performance became physically visible. While Cartwright's smooth logs continued to crack and split with loud reports that sounded like pistol shots in the night, Nyberg's logs remained stable. The bark slowed the drying process, allowing the moisture inside the timber to equalize gradually with the outside air. This prevented the violent tension that tore open the grain of the peeled logs. When rain lashed against Nyberg's cabin, the water ran down the ridges of the bark and dripped harmlessly to the ground, never penetrating to the wood fiber beneath. The derision from the community began to fade into confusion as the second and third years passed. The anticipated collapse of the lazy Swedish cabin did not happen. Instead, while Cartwright and others found themselves replacing rotted sill logs and repacking wet chinking every autumn, Nyberg's structure stood unaltered. The dark, furrowed walls of his home appeared organic and impenetrable, shedding the weather rather than absorbing it. The unpeeled logs had formed a cohesive shell that protected the structural timber, proving that the extra labor of peeling had not only been a waste of time, but a structural liability. The stark contrast between the rotting checked walls of the standard cabins and the solid seasoned state of Nyberg's home raised a quiet, uncomfortable question across the settlement. If the manuals were wrong about peeling, what else about their construction methods was flawed? The visual evidence suggested that the uneducated immigrant had understood a fundamental principle of wood preservation that the experts had missed entirely. But preserving the wood was only the first hurdle. The true test of the cabin's design would come when the temperature dropped well below zero, challenging the thermal dynamics of the frontier home. As the first hard frost of 1869 clamped down on the upper Midwest, the difference between merely building a shelter and engineering a survival system became undeniable. While most homesteaders had finished their construction during the mild days of late autumn, retreating indoors to burn through their wood piles, Lars Nyberg was only just beginning the most critical phase of his material acquisition. The community had watched him construct his first cabin with unpeeled logs, but now, observing him prepare timber for an expansion, they noticed another peculiar deviation from standard frontier practice. He refused to fell his trees until the temperature dropped significantly and the deep snows had set in. The timing of the harvest was not a matter of scheduling convenience, but a calculated decision based on the hydraulic systems of the pine trees. During the spring and summer, the cambium layer beneath the bark is flush with fluid sap, acting as a lubricant that allows the tree to grow. If a tree is cut during these warmer months, the bark remains loose and is prone to slipping off or being damaged during transport. However, Nyberg knew that waiting for the deep freeze changed the biology of the material. In the dead of winter, the sap descends to the roots, and the remaining moisture in the cambium freezes, effectively gluing the bark to the wood. By harvesting only when the forest was locked in ice, Nyberg ensured that the protective layer he prized would adhere so tightly, it became structurally inseparable from the timber itself. This adherence was essential because Nyberg was not looking for a siding material, he was looking for insulation. The standard peeled logs used by neighbors like John Cartwright were composed entirely of solid heartwood and sapwood. While wood is a better insulator than stone, a solid, dense log still acts as a thermal bridge when the temperature differential is extreme. At 20 degrees below zero, a peeled log freezes through. The cold permeates the dense fiber, and the interior surface of the wall becomes an ice block that actively sucks heat from the room. This phenomenon, known as radiant cooling, meant that no matter how large a fire Cartwright built, the walls themselves remained cold, creating a constant draft as warm air cooled against the timber and sank to the floor. Nyberg's unpeeled logs functioned differently due to the physics of the bark itself. The outer bark of the white pine is not dense wood. It is a complex, corky matrix of dead cells filled with tiny air pockets. In construction terms, stagnant air is the primary mechanic of insulation. By leaving this rough, chaotic layer intact, Nyberg was wrapping his home in thousands of tiny air traps that interrupted the conductive path of the cold. The bark acted as a thermal break, separating the frozen exterior atmosphere from the structural wood of the wall. This principle was not unique to Scandinavian heritage. It was a convergent technology well understood by the indigenous people of the Great Lakes. Elder O'Keefe, a builder within the local Ojibwa community, recognized the logic immediately. For generations, the Ojibwa had utilized the thermal and water-resistant properties of birch and pine bark in their wigwams and storage caches. They understood that the skin of the tree was designed by evolution to regulate temperature and protect the organism from freezing to death. When O'Keefe observed Nyberg hauling winter-felled timber with the bark rough and intact, there was a mutual recognition of functional mastery. The settler was not inventing a new method, but rather aligning himself with a biological reality that the indigenous population had mastered centuries prior. The tree is warmer with its coat on. The validity of this approach was tested during a week-long blizzard in late January, where temperatures hovered near 30 degrees below zero for days. In the standard peeled log cabins, the situation became desperate. The sheer density of the exposed wood allowed the freeze to penetrate deep into the cabin structure. Families found that water buckets froze solid even when placed just a few feet from the hearth. The only way to combat the infiltrating cold was to maintain a roaring fire 24 hours a day. This created a dangerous cycle where the stove or fireplace was red hot, creating a small radius of scorching heat, while the corners of the room remained dangerously cold. Inside Nyberg's cabin, the atmosphere was remarkably different. Because the bark prevented the logs from deep freezing, the interior surface of the walls stayed closer to the ambient temperature of the room. This seemingly small difference in wall temperature had a massive impact on thermal comfort. Without the cold walls creating strong convection currents, the air inside the cabin remained still and stratified. Heat generated by the stove stayed in the living space rather than being leached away by the structure. The family could sit comfortably near the walls without feeling the chill radiating from the timber. The metrics of survival during that week revealed the stark efficiency of the system. Nyberg recorded interior temperatures that held steady at 12 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than his neighbors' homes during the pre-dawn hours, the coldest part of the day. This retained warmth meant that the thermal load on his heating source was significantly lower. While Cartwright and other neighbors were forced to venture out into the drifts daily to replenish their wood supplies, exhausting their calorie reserves in the dangerous cold, Nyberg's fuel consumption was roughly 40% lower. This reduction in firewood usage rippled out into every aspect of homestead life. Less wood burned meant less time spent felling, bucking, and splitting timber, a labor-intensive cycle that often led to injury or exhaustion. By relying on the tree's natural insulation, Nyberg effectively regained hundreds of hours of labor that his neighbors burned up in their fireplaces. The lazy decision to leave the bark on had resulted in a home that worked for him rather than a home he had to work for constantly. As the winter finally broke, the psychological impact on the community was as significant as the physical one. The myth that peeled logs were the only proper way to build had been shattered not by argument, but by the brutal reality of a Minnesota January. The neighbors could see that Nyberg's woodpile was still high, while theirs were depleted. They had built structures designed to look like the drawings in a book, while Nyberg had built a thermal envelope adapted to the environment. However, as the snow melted and the spring rains arrived, the community waited for the second inevitable problem they were sure would destroy Nyberg's bark-clad fortress: the rot. They had conceded the warmth, but they were certain the moisture of spring would turn that insulation into a sponge. Little did they know, Newberg had already treated the base of his cabin with a viscous, dark substance harvested from the forest itself, preparing for a threat they had not yet begun to understand. With the spring thaw came a threat far more insidious than the biting cold of January. As the snowpack melted into a sea of mud, the settler community braced for what they considered the inevitable demise of the unpeeled cabin. The logic of the frontier held that moisture was the enemy of wood, and that bark acted as a sponge, holding dampness against the timber until the log turned to mush. Neighbors watched Lars Nyberg's homestead with a grim sense of anticipation, expecting the damp spring air to activate the fungal spores that destroy dead trees in the wild. They were correct about the biological mechanism of decay, but they completely misunderstood how Nyberg was engineering his defense against it. The primary cause of structural failure in log cabins is not surface water, but the colonization of the wood fiber by fungi that digest cellulose. For these organisms to thrive, they require oxygen, a food source, and a moisture content above 20%. The standard practice of peeling logs, which John Cartwright and others adhered to, actually accelerated this process in the wet season. When a log is peeled and the grain is exposed, the wood fibers act like a bundle of open straws. Through a process called capillary action, ground moisture and rain splash are wicked upward into the cellular structure of the timber. Once the water penetrates deep into the wood, it becomes nearly impossible to dry out, creating the perfect incubator for rot. Nyberg addressed this vulnerability not by removing the protective layer, but by chemically sealing the cabin's most critical weak points. Throughout the previous autumn, he had collected gallons of sticky amber resin from wounds he deliberately inflicted on living pine trees in the surrounding forest. This raw pine pitch was not merely sap. It was a complex chemical cocktail produced by the tree specifically to kill pests and seal injuries. To the casual observer, it was a sticky nuisance, but to a builder with Nyberg's lineage, it was nature's most potent waterproofing agent and antiseptic. In the weeks before the full thaw, Nyberg set up a large iron kettle over an outdoor fire, filling it with the hardened globs of harvested resin. To this, he added a measured amount of rendered animal tallow. The fat was a crucial addition derived from both Scandinavian boat-building traditions and the indigenous knowledge of the region. Pure pine pitch becomes brittle and cracks when it freezes, but the addition of tallow acted as a plasticizer, keeping the mixture flexible enough to expand and contract with the wood through the seasons. When the mixture reached a boiling, black consistency, Nyberg applied it thick and hot to the undersides of his sill logs, the bottommost timbers that sat nearest to the damp earth. However, the most distinct application was on the log ends. The corner notches of a cabin exposed the cross-section of the heartwood, the most absorbent part of the tree. Leaving these ends raw, as was common in standard construction, was equivalent to leaving the cap off a marker pen. They dried out rapidly and sucked in water just as fast. Nyberg painted the boiling pitch mixture over every exposed log end until the wood could absorb no more, capping the vascular system of the tree. This effectively closed the door to moisture ingress, preventing the capillary wicking that was already beginning to darken the corners of the neighbors' cabins. This chemical barrier was supported by a structural layout that Elder O'Keefe, the local Ojibwa builder, had reinforced in Nyberg's design plan. The Ojibwa understood that rot was a symptom of poor airflow. A log laying directly on the soil, or even on a low stone foundation, would rot regardless of its bark status because the dead air underneath trapped humidity. Nyberg elevated his foundation stones significantly higher than the standard, leaving nearly 18 inches of clearance beneath the first run of logs. This allowed the prevailing winds to sweep underneath the cabin, carrying away ground moisture before it could condense on the timber. The unpeeled bark on the logs, rather than trapping water, acted as a hydrophobic shingle, shedding rain splash away from the inner wood while the pitch sealed the gaps. By the time the second autumn harvest arrived, the physical divergence between the two building methods was measurable in terms of structural integrity. In the cabins built by Cartwright and others, the lower logs began to show the classic symptoms of punkiness. The wood at the corners, where water had wicked in through the exposed grain, was becoming soft to the touch. Settlers found themselves scraping away layers of gray, fuzzy pulp in an attempt to reach solid wood, a maintenance task that consumed hours of labor. More alarmingly, the rot was causing the cabins to settle unevenly, jamming door frames and cracking windows as the foundation logs compressed under the weight of the roof. In stark contrast, a check of Nyberg's sill logs revealed timber that was as sound as the day it was felled. The mixture of pitch and tallow had cured into a hard, dark enamel that repelled water entirely. Even where the bark touched the chinking, the wood beneath remained dry and bright. The resin had not only waterproofed the logs, but it also leached into the outer layers of the bark, creating a zone that was toxic to fungal spores and insects. The economic implication of this preservation was massive. By the 5-year mark, the average settler using the peeled log method could expect to replace their bottom logs, a dangerous and expensive operation that involved jacking up the entire house. Nyberg's maintenance during that same period was restricted to reapplying a light coat of pitch to the weather-facing corners, a task that took less than one afternoon. The unpeeled logs, protected by the resin and the airflow, were effectively fossilizing in place rather than decaying. The community, which had mocked the dirty look of the bark and the strange smell of boiling pitch, was forced to confront the reality that their clean white logs were dissolving beneath their feet, while Nyberg's dark, resin-coated fortress remained impervious to the rot that claimed everything else on the frontier. By the early 1870s, the disparity between the Nyberg homestead and the surrounding settlement had evolved from a curiosity into a visible economic gap. While neighbors like John Cartwright found themselves trapped in an endless cycle of palliative maintenance, spending their autumns wedging new chinking into widening cracks and replacing sodden roof shingles, Lars Nyberg had effectively ceased all major structural work. His cabin, now fully seasoned, allowed him to direct his energy outward toward expanding his acreage and improving his livestock herds. However, the durability of his unpeeled logs and the efficacy of his pitch ceiling were only components of a larger, more comprehensive architecture. The final phase of his construction system was not about the materials themselves, but how the structure manipulated the environment around it through geometry and orientation. The American frontier was organized by the Public Land Survey System, a rigid grid that divided the wilderness into square-mile sections oriented strictly north, south, east, and west. Settlers, in a bid to demonstrate order and compliance, almost universally aligned their cabins with these cardinal directions, facing their front doors square to the survey lines. This adherence to the map ignored the nuances of the local microclimate. By placing a cabin wall flat against the prevailing northwest wind, settlers maximized the surface area exposed to the fiercest weather. Nyberg, guided by the observational habits of both his Scandinavian ancestors and the local Ojibwa population, broke this grid. He rotated his building site, angling the long axis of the cabin to face south by southeast. This precise orientation was the engine of his passive energy system. In the deep winter, the sun hangs low on the southern horizon. By angling the broad side of the cabin toward this arc, Nyberg ensured that his windows and the mass of the front wall captured the maximum amount of solar radiation during the short daylight hours. Conversely, the north-facing wall, which bore the brunt of the Arctic winds sweeping down from the Canadian plains, was built low and entirely without penetrations. There were no windows and no doors on the windward side, turning the back of the cabin into an aerodynamic shield that deflected the gale rather than catching it. While his neighbors' stoves fought a losing battle against drafts forced through their north-facing door jambs, the air pressure on Nyberg's leeward side remained neutral, preserving the static heat envelope inside. To further fortify this system, Nyberg implemented a structural feature that looked wasteful to the frugal American eye: the extended cantilevered roof. Standard settler cabins typically featured eaves that cropped close to the walls, rarely extending more than 6 to 8 inches. This conserved valuable lumber, but it exposed the cabin walls to everything the sky dropped. Nyberg extended his roof purlins, the horizontal logs that support the roof deck, out a full 3 feet beyond the walls on all sides. This deep, brooding overhang acted as a permanent umbrella for the structure. The functional impact of these deep eaves was immediate and twofold. During the summer, when the sun was high overhead, the 3-foot shadow completely shaded the cabin walls, preventing the unpeeled logs from absorbing heat and turning the interior into an oven. In the winter, when the sun dipped low, the light bypassed the eaves and struck the wood, warming the home. More importantly, the overhangs moved the drip line of the rain far away from the foundation. When heavy thunderstorms hammered the plains, the water cascading off Nyberg's roof struck the ground 3 feet away from his sill logs, virtually eliminating the splashback effect that was rotting out the bottom courses of the Cartwright cabin. The unpeeled bark on Nyberg's walls, already water-resistant, remained almost entirely dry even during storms, protected by the massive brim of the roof. The final component of this integrated system was the introduction of the vindfang, or wine catch, a concept borrowed directly from Nordic architecture and reinforced by indigenous wisdom regarding heat conservation. In almost every standard frontier cabin, the front door opened directly into the main living space. Every entry and exit allowed a massive volume of warm air to escape, replaced instantly by a blast of sub-zero atmosphere that cooled the entire room. To combat this, Nyberg constructed a small enclosed vestibule on the south-facing, sheltered side of the house. This vestibule functioned as a thermal airlock. It was an unheated buffer zone where one could enter from the outside, close the outer door, and shed snow-covered boots or coats before opening the inner door to the warm living quarters. By trapping a layer of intermediate air between the frozen exterior and the heated interior, Nyberg prevented the violent temperature exchange that occurred in other homes. The vestibule also acted as a storage locker for firewood, keeping the day's fuel dry and accessible without forcing the family to open the main thermal seal of the home. When combined, these elements, the winter-felled unpeeled timber, the pitch-sealed end grain, the solar orientation, the deep protective eaves, and the airlock entry, created a machine for living that was radically more efficient than the surrounding standard. The measurements taken over the course of 1872 confirmed the synergy of these techniques. While the insulation of the bark provided a 12-degree advantage, the addition of the windshielding orientation and the airlock pushed the performance even further. Nyberg's total firewood consumption for the year dropped to 45% less than the average recorded by his neighbors. This was not merely a saving of wood, it was a saving of life. It represented weeks of backbreaking labor that Nyberg did not have to perform. He did not have to drag logs through deep snow in February. He did not have to wake 3 times a night to stoke a dying fire. His cabin held its heat through the long nights, allowing for uninterrupted sleep and better health. The durability metrics were equally stark. 5 years after construction, the deep eaves and pitch ceiling meant that Nyberg's unpeeled logs showed zero signs of the rot that was currently devouring the town's earliest structures. The walls were hard, the foundation was dry, and the structure had not shifted an inch. The neighbors, who had once mocked the lazy builder for skipping the peeling process, now stood in their drafty settling homes, looking across the fence at a system that had turned the brutal conditions of the frontier into a manageable variable. Nyberg had not just built a cabin, he had engineered a way to opt out of the struggle that was killing the cabins around him. The ultimate test of the unpeeled log system arrived in January of 1873, with the onset of a weather event that would be recorded in regional history as the Great Storm. Until this point, the debate between Lars Nyberg and his neighbors had been one of efficiency and maintenance, matters of degrees and dollars. The blizzard that struck on the 7th of January changed the calculus entirely. It was a storm that dropped nearly 30 inches of snow in 48 hours, accompanied by gale-force winds that drove the wind chill down to deadly extremities. The storm did not merely test the insulation of the cabins. It attacked their structural cohesion through massive vertical loading. In the world of log building, the roof must bear the weight of the snow, but the walls must transfer that load to the foundation. For the standard peeled log cabins inhabited by John Cartwright and the majority of the settlement, this transfer of force revealed a catastrophic weakness that had been festering unseen. The years of punkiness and soft rot in the corner notches, the inevitable result of the peeling and water wicking described earlier, had compromised the density of the wood. Under the crushing weight of nearly 30 tons of snow accumulating on the roof, the softened timber at the corners began to compress. This compression had a violent mechanical side effect that the settlers had not anticipated: chinking failure. A log wall is a composite structure of timber and mortar. For the seal to hold, the logs must remain rigid. As Cartwright's peeled logs squashed down under the snow load, the gaps between the logs narrowed unpredictably, popping the dried clay and lime mortar out of the joints. The fierce wind screaming across the plains found these new openings instantly. Inside the Cartwright home, the failure was physical and terrifying. Chunks of chinking fell onto the floorboards, followed immediately by jets of freezing air and fine, powdery snow that drifted across the living space. The house was effectively unraveling, losing its ability to hold back the atmosphere just when protection was most critical. Less than 2 miles away, the Nyberg homestead faced the exact same atmospheric violence, but exhibited a radically different structural response. Because the unpeeled pitch-sealed logs had resisted the moisture absorption that softened the neighbor's timber, Nyberg's walls retained their original compressive strength. There was no settling, no squashing of the notches, and therefore no movement to dislodge the chinking. The building envelope remained airtight. Furthermore, the rough texture of the bark, which neighbors had claimed would harbor pests, performed a surprising service during the blizzard. It captured and held a layer of wind-driven snow against the exterior wall, allowing it to pack tight without sliding off. On a peeled log, snow banking against the wall melts from the escaped interior heat, turning into ice and water that rots the wood. But because Nyberg's walls were so well insulated and thermally broken by the bark, the exterior surface remained cold enough that the snow did not melt. Instead, this bank of snow acted as a secondary, temporary layer of insulation, an igloo effect that further sealed the cabin against the drop in temperature. While Cartwright and others were stuffing rags and bedding into the blowing holes in their walls, Nyberg's family sat in a structure that had integrated the storm into its defense system. The duration of the storm brought a second logistic crisis: fuel exhaustion. The violence of the wind made it impossible to go outside to the woodpile. Families were forced to rely on whatever firewood was stacked inside. In the drafty, failing shells of the standard cabins, stoves were run at maximum capacity in a futile attempt to counter the heat loss from the blown-out chinking. Cartwright burned through his indoor reserve in less than 36 hours. By the third day, they were breaking up furniture to keep the stove warm enough to prevent frostbite. In contrast, the efficiency of the Nyberg system granted them the gift of time. The heat retention of the bark-clad walls, combined with the vestibule airlock, meant their stove required only a fraction of the fuel to maintain a survivable temperature. When the storm finally broke on the fourth morning, Lars Nyberg opened his door to a landscape of white silence. He still had a day's worth of wood stacked in his antechamber. He hiked over the drifts to check on the Cartwrights, finding them huddled under every blanket they owned in a house that was scarcely 20 degrees above zero. The vindication was silent, but absolute. John Cartwright, the man who had mocked the lazy, unpeeled logs, did not say a word about construction methods. He simply moved his family into Nyberg's main room until the weather stabilized. The aftermath of the great storm marked the death of the old conventional wisdom in that specific corner of the frontier. Mary Cartwright, having survived the freeze in the comfort of the Nyberg cabin, refused to spend another winter in her rotting home. The following spring saw a wave of renovation across the settlement, but it was not done according to the Army manuals. Under the guidance of Henrik Jensen and Elder O'Keefe, settlers began retrofitting their structures. They jacked up their cabins to treat the sills with pitch and stopped peeling the timber for their new barns and additions. The Nyberg method, a synthesis of indigenous material science, Scandinavian tradition, and American practicality, became the new standard for the local architecture. Decades later, when historians and architects began documenting the structures of the surviving homesteads, they noted a peculiar anomaly in the region's decay rates. The cabins built during the rush of the late 1860s had almost all vanished, returned to the earth as mounds of compost. Yet, scattered among the modern farmhouses, the unpeeled log structures from the 1870s and 80s still stood. Some had been converted into sheds, others into guest cottages, But the timber remained sound. The legacy of the unpeeled log was not just a triumph of one man's stubbornness, it was a lesson in context. The settlers had arrived with a rigid idea of what a civilized building looked like, prioritizing aesthetics and standardized rules over the biological reality of the materials. Lars Nyberg had looked at the tree, the climate, and the rot, and built a solution that respected all three. In doing so, he proved that on the unforgiving edge of the frontier, the most advanced technology was often the one that looked the most primitive. The rough, mossy, unpeeled log was not a sign of laziness. It was the armor that allowed a family to endure, survive, and ultimately to stay.